Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you so much everyone for coming. We're going to just kick start it now. Thank you for everyone who's joining in the webinar, and thank you for everyone who is joining on Facebook. It's great to meet you, I guess, even though we can't even see you. But if you have any questions or comments throughout the entire discussion, feel free to, if you're on Facebook, put them in the comments chat. If you're on the webinar, feel free to put them into either the Q&A or the chat, and we will read them. We'll answer them live. So this is a very interactive discussion today. So thank you so much for coming. And feel free to try and send in your comments and questions. So without further ado, I will introduce what we're talking about today, which is whether or not we should use the term migrant, which is going to be really, really interesting. We have lots of fantastic panelists here today, and I'm really excited to introduce them. First of all, I want to say thank you for everyone who has come to our EU Citizens Politics Festival. This week has been a week full of different discussions and workshops and webinars to try and raise awareness that EU citizens in the UK can vote in local elections. That is our goal, just to raise awareness. The registration deadline is this Monday. So if you're not already registered to vote, go out, register. It'll take 5 minutes. You can do it on the government website. It's completely free, and it will boost your credit score, which is also great. So make sure that you're out and make sure you're registered, and then make sure you go out and vote on May 6th in local elections in England. So that's our first thing. That's what we're trying to do with this webinar, but we're also just trying to have really interesting conversations, and that's what we're going to be doing today. So without further ado, I will stop talking because you want to hear from our fantastic panelists, and introduce everybody. So today we have Shukri, Chris, Alicia, and Kimberly. Thank you so much everyone for coming, and I will let you all introduce yourselves and talk about why your voice needs to be heard on this matter today, and why you're invited, why it's important to hear from you. And it's very important to hear from everyone here. I need to clarify. So we'll start off with Shukri. I would love to hear a little bit of who you are and why you're here.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Antonia. Okay, so my name is Shukri. I'm from London. I'm originally, well, I've always been a Dutch citizen, but I'm a Dutch citizen. Lived in the Netherlands since I was about 8.5, and moved to the UK. Well, straight into primary school here, and lost my Dutch accent. Gained a British, a London accent, and yeah, I always kind of felt in for like years before the Brexit vote, especially, I didn't feel particularly like a migrant or an immigrant or anything. I just felt like me, probably closer to my British friends, because there's not much difference except our passport. We speak the same, we enjoy the same things. I kind of lost a bit of connection to my Dutch childhood because of the language. Even all my memories, even in English, and not even in Dutch. Everything was in Dutch, and I didn't know a thing before I came here. And I find, and even when I explain that I'm not British, people are quite surprised. They don't expect that because, oh, you don't sound that, or are you sure you weren't born here? I mean, I wasn't, but sometimes I feel like I was because there's not much difference in one of my British friends or something, and yeah, so everything that the Brexit vote happened, I kind of felt a shift. I Because there was a difference. I mean, I was looked at as an immigrant, not as an expat, but as an immigrant, and that kind of that always that has negative connotations, it seems. So that kind of pushed me away to that I wanted to embrace my Dutch identity even more, and you know I had a bit of an identity crisis. I still do. Sometimes, even yesterday, I went to the Dutch embassy to renew my passport, and I realized I couldn't speak to the lady at the counter because I don't speak Dutch. Thankfully, they speak English, but there's that connection of, oh, I don't speak the language, and yet, I mean, I don't speak the language. So am I really, but I mean, it goes through a whole. I get into a big identity crisis each time. So, and then I just think, am I British then, or am I a migrant? What am I? And yeah, it's just really complex. So this discussion is really interesting to have because a lot of people share my views. You know, there's a lot of Dutch culture. And the kids, I mean, my parents are not even Dutch, obviously, but my parents migrated to the Netherlands. They were refugees, and I wasn't automatically a refugee anyway because I was born Dutch. But there's always been that kind of identity kind of discussion in my family because my parents still regard themselves as refugees and not as Dutch citizens, even though they're thankful for the Dutch people from hosting them, but they are very cognizant of where they're from. But I'm not from. I am from Somalia, but I've never been there. There's not that connection of what they had before the war. So I'm in that middle of three countries. Of each of them have played a big part of my identity and my childhood. And then there's always that uncertainty, like what am I? Am I a migrant, an expat, or an immigrant? Yeah. So that's me.
Thank you so much. And yes, I think having all these discussions today is going to be like really eye-opening. And I've had an identity crisis in the past as well. So I definitely understand that as well. Mine is a bit different. I'm from Northern Ireland, and it's the whole, am I Irish? Am I from the UK? Am I both? Is it? So I understand what you're saying there, and obviously not to the same extent, but definitely get that. The next person I want to introduce as well for our fantastic panel is Kimberly from We Belong. Would love to hear a little bit of context about you and why you're here today.
Thank you, Antonia. So I'm Kimberly and I'm the outreach officer at We Belong, and we are a charity for young migrants aged 16 to 25. So I come from this issue, I guess, as a young migrant myself. I'm originally from Zimbabwe, and I came from Zimbabwe to the UK when I was 9 to be joined to live with my parents. And it wasn't until I got to the point of wanting to go to university after I'd had my formative education in the UK. And it wasn't that up until that point of being told that I was going to be given international fees and I was also not entitled to student finance. That was my first realization of, oh, okay, I'm different. What is this difference? Okay, it's because I'm a migrant. And prior to that, I guess the term migrant wasn't something that I'd always associated with myself, because I don't know whether it's naivety, but it's not something I had the perception that maybe a migrant was obviously somebody who's come from another country to live somewhere else. But for some reason, I hadn't closely resonated with that up until the point of being blocked from accessing services. And that hit me really, really hard. And then that's when I found We Belong, who were at the time called Let Us Learn. And it was just a campaign group of young people who had also been blocked from accessing higher education. And then it was at that point that all of us were realizing, okay, we're migrants and this is what our status means. And these are the things that we're blocked from accessing. So I'm coming from this issue at that angle, but we try and use the term migrant in a positive way and sort of changing a counter narrative, if you call it, to the UK's hostile environment.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. And you make a fantastic point that we need to keep in mind in this discussion today, that, this isn't just a philosophical debate about whether or not to use a certain word, but this actual word has repercussions, and it does have a lot of bureaucracy and complications tied to it. And this word, just by using it, has effects on people, really, really important effects. So that kind of refrains this conversation and why it's so important to have this conversation as well. So thank you so much. And everyone watching, I recommend you check out We Belong, because they are a fantastic organization. So we will put that in the chat, the link to their page. They're fantastic. So the next person I want to introduce is Chris. Thank you so much for coming, Chris, today. And please tell us why you're here and who you are.
Okay, so I'm Chris Bertram. I'm Emeritus Professor of Social and Political Philosophy at the University of Bristol. And for the last few years, I've been working on questions to do with migration, political philosophy, political theory of migration. And I wrote a book called Do States Have the Right to Exclude Immigrants, which came out 3 years ago now. And I'm also kind of quite strongly involved with a refugee charity here in Bristol. So I'm a trustee for Bristol Refugee Rights and being quite active around refugee and asylum issues. I also feel this issue of migrants' rights, particularly as arising from Brexit, quite personally, because both of my children are in relationships with migrants from other parts of the European Union, from Germany and from Poland, and that sort of caused some issues, some decisions around naturalization, that kind of thing. And my sister lives in France, but has worked most of her working life until recently in Switzerland. So she lived in France and she commuted across the border to Switzerland. And now with Brexit, there's a whole set of complications, particularly for people who are the so-called frontalier, the people who travel across borders in order to work and trying to kind of regularize their status. So there's lots of anxieties in different ways in my family that make all of this into kind of quite a personal issue. So I'm really enthusiastic about having a discussion around this question. I also think one of the things that's really great about sort of talking about kind of migration and citizenship is that it's like lifting a stone and looking underneath the stone, that so many of the kind of assumptions we make about how the state works, how the world works, get looked at in a really different light when we see how kind of people get treated just because they have the wrong citizenship, the wrong nationality, the wrong papers, can't prove who they are, all of those kinds of things. And I think that's a kind of really interesting thing, and we have to kind of hang on to our humanity and look at people as people rather than thinking of them so much in terms of these categories.
Yes, and thank you so much. I'm super excited to have this academic professional experience on this as well, to be able to understand, what has the academic research and literature said on this before, because I think that's also a really interesting angle to bring into it as well. I don't know, we've lost someone there, Shukri, but in the meantime, I'd love to introduce Alicia. Thank you so much for coming as well. Let us know a little bit about you and why you're here today.
Hi, so my name is Alicja Kaczmarek. I moved to the UK in 2004 and I moved from Poland. So I think when I first moved in, I was very enthusiastic. I was kind of trying to fully embrace this, freedom of movement just after Poland joined the EU. But I think it took maybe a few months before we started realizing what it means to be a migrant in the UK. So I think the first few months after EU enlargement was fairly quiet, but then the media, they picked on the topic fairly quickly, and especially they picked on the Polish migrants. So very often we would just see on Daily Mail and other tabloids and newspapers information about Polish migrants, from kind of starting with that being accused from eating the swans or misbehaving, not following any rules, and fishing and lots of other things. So obviously the stereotype of Polish migrants developed very quickly, and even now, until now, sometimes we find it that a Polish migrant is synonymous of all Eastern European migrants. Not always, but yeah, it's very clear for many people what a migrant or Polish migrant or Eastern European migrant is, and this is, I think, what currently my identity is. So I've noticed also very quickly after the mass migration happened that people are not really integrating very well. People are not settling, not adapting. There was this hostility towards people, but also coming from Eastern Europe, from the countries which never had much experience of living in the UK. It was a little bit difficult. So I've set up an organization trying to help migrants. In the beginning, we focused on Polish migrants, and that's why we called the organization Polish Expats Association. And we use the term purposely expat. At the time, we thought it would be a good idea to emphasize that not only Western Europeans, when they move abroad, can be called expats. We are just expats because we chose to live in another country. Now, from this perspective, after the, I don't know, 10 years of running, probably wouldn't do that. We embrace the identity of the migrant, and calling ourselves expats never really worked. This kind of equality between different type of people moving around is never happened. So we kind of accepting that and trying to embrace it and make a most of it. A few years ago, we set up a gallery space, well, basically project space in Birmingham, called Centrala. We started embracing all Eastern European migrants. We promote and we focus on promoting Central and Eastern European art and culture. We have this idea of bringing very high quality culture and art from Eastern Europe. We're trying to balance this negative stereotype and the portrait that Eastern European migrants only came here to do manual jobs. That's all associated with Eastern Europe. We're trying to provide a space for Central and Eastern European migrants so they can experience their own art and culture, but also others to come, get into the conversation, learn a little bit more, and realize that Eastern Europe is the part of the world which has really a lot to offer. And we are really proud of what we've achieved in Birmingham. Centrala grew to be quite diverse and very inclusive space. It's quite well known in Birmingham now. We have this feel of being like very open, very inclusive, not just for migrants, but from Europe, but from other parts of the world. We also really good on human rights and gender equality, LGBTQ+ community. So we have loads of cultural events, happenings, and projects in our space. So we're working on changing our name legally now to Centrala, which embrace more and show more what we're doing at the moment. So that's this part. As I said, my identity is very strongly as migrant, and I don't think it will ever change, even though I'm planning to apply for the citizenship. I don't think I will be treated any different once I will get this, passport. I think that will always be the case. How we look at the migrants, our perspective is pretty much focused on Central and Eastern European migration. So we knew for many years that there is that there is an issue, there is a problem. Eastern European artists we work with, curators, producers, and other creatives always reported to us they don't really feel fully accepted, because on one hand, people who didn't qualify in the UK, their qualifications are not recognized. So obviously we focus pretty much on art and creative sector. We know it's any sector really, but in arts, where sometimes people expect that this division will be so strong and acceptance is easier, but it's not so much. So a couple of years ago, we started working with University on Birmingham, and actually we conducted research into underrepresentation of Eastern European migrants, Eastern European art and culture, and attitudes toward migrant kind of cultural workers. Our evidence kind of clearly show how excluded people feel, and it's not just that some people maybe identify very strongly as migrants, some people don't. Some people identify as Europeans, or after living many years in the UK, people feel residents here, but they still experience hostility. But what we also know, and we discovered, that there is this gap in the provision, because there is obviously a lot of diversity measures, or maybe integration, community cohesion, and maybe anti-racism measures, but they do not include Eastern European migrants, who they also feel they experience xenoracism very often. But this is not part of the, what would you call, kind of BME or BAME movements and measures taken to include other communities. So we called our report In Between Spaces, because this is exactly how people find themselves. They don't really belong to the host communities, but they don't also belong to the communities describing themselves as diverse, BME, BAME, I know there's lots of other identities. So there is some kind of space in between for Eastern Europeans, and so it's almost like a subgroup from all the EU migrants or the migrants in general. So there is something Eastern European identity which caused the otherness and exclusion in the UK. So that's just the intro to what I do.
Yes, thank you so much. And everyone who's watching, please again look up Central. We have the link in our chat as well. Fantastic organization, and what they're doing is really, really important too. But yes, what you said brings us to our first question, which is it's really important to clarify what all these different words mean. So labels are really, really important to people because they are connected so heavily to identity. You know, if you think about, you know, political labels, whether you are conservative or Labour, any Lib Dem or any of the different parties, you know, race labels, different gender labels, sexuality labels. Sometimes labels can do a lot of damage, but sometimes labels can free a person in feeling at one with their identity as well. So it's really important to understand the power of labels in general, both in a positive and negative light. So based upon that, I wanted to clarify with everybody what all these different labels meant and what's the difference between them, because some people use them interchangeably. You know, the idea of migrant, immigrant, expat, even asylum seeker and refugee, those two things are so different, but people use them interchangeably, which is problematic in itself. But I want to focus on, you know, these words of immigrant and migrant, non-citizen, expat, those four in particular, and any others that you find relevant, because you guys are the experts here. I would love to hear from you what you think those mean, what those mean to you, what's the difference between them, and why is that difference important? So I'll open that up to the whole group, and whoever wants to come in, would love to hear from you.
I guess I'll start. I was going to say, at We Belong, we describe a migrant as somebody who's moved from one place to another, whether it's just, I guess, according to the dictionary term, somebody who moves either temporarily or permanently, but they've just moved from one area or one country to another, or they could have just moved in the same country to a different location. And I think for us, it's very important that we don't place any, I don't know, I wanted to say label, but we try and use the term migrant in a positive way, almost as in there is nothing in terms of the difference between a migrant and a citizen apart from you've just moved from one place to another. So the only difference is that movement, but nothing to do with anything negative. However, we do find that obviously in the world that we're operating in, sometimes different stories of migrants can be told differently. So what we are really heavy on is when young people get to understanding their immigration status first and foremost, and have that first confrontation of, okay, I'm not British, and I wasn't born here, or maybe I've moved and I've now relocated here. What does this mean for me? We try and, I guess, empower them to look at that in a more positive way. So not letting go of their roots from the origins of where they come from, but also embracing that British identity. So sometimes migrant can be used to just, I guess, describe the mesh between the both locations. But I think another thing that we find is that with the term itself, sometimes it can be problematic when people, I guess, place add-ons. So illegal migrant, or, you know, suggesting unlawfulness. So I think from a We Belong perspective, we try and keep it positive and try and, you know, embrace that side. But when we talk about a migrant, it's covering all types of statuses. So asylum seeker, refugee, people with limited leave to remain, because they too moved from one place to another, whether that was for economic reasons or it was for the purpose of fleeing to seek refuge or sanctuary. We try and group that together. And I know maybe that could be seen as problematic because obviously you're using one terminology, but I think that avoids the idea of grouping the categories, because then it's almost, if you then almost just say, okay, young migrants and refugees, or young migrants and asylum seekers, I don't know, I think to separate the two would then possibly cause some sort of friction in terms of inclusivity, because we also find when we're operating in this space, whether it's lobbying for access to higher education or trying to get the law changed, it's hard to cover all of those groups under one bracket. And often people within government or within these bureaucratic organizations don't understand the differences between those statuses. And I think this is something we're going to see as well with Brexit now, in the situation that Europeans are in. And it's almost this displacement, you know, by having this label. I don't know, it also affects people's identity, I think.
Thank you so much, Kim. I would love to hear Chris and hear your academic perspective on this as well.
Yeah, so I think I want to say a couple of things about this label of migrant. And the first thing to say is that it's not that there's some kind of reality out there that this kind of word hooks onto. Rather, this status of being a migrant or being an immigrant is something that's being constructed by lawyers, policymakers, statisticians, sociologists. There's lots of different definitions, lots of different statuses, and they often don't map onto one another. So it's not as if there's a kind of real phenomenon that this word always tracks. There's a whole series of different things, and sometimes people fit under one definition and sometimes they fit under another definition or not. And the other thing to say is that there's a really problematic history to all this, which is that, you know, these distinctions between people as being kind of migrants and natives, say, or expats, they stem from distinctions that were made by colonial administrators back in the 19th century. So if you think about the kind of British Empire, you had the British colonial administrators, and they would think of themselves as being kind of Europeans. They're the ancestors, as it were, of the expat category. And then you'd have people who were classified as being of the place that was being administered, or people who were classified as being out of place. And those were kind of determined to be migrants. And this has really terrible consequences later on, because once we start building a world of kind of nation states as opposed to empires, and start talking about things like kind of national self-determination, all those kind of things, then some of those people, perhaps they've lived on the territory of some state for generations, but they can be kind of thought of as being not being of the place, as being in some sense migrants, even though they've never moved anywhere. So a really kind of terrible example of this is the Rohingya minority in Myanmar / Burma. So they're thought of by the official kind of Myanmar authorities as being kind of illegal immigrants, as being basically people from Bangladesh, even though they've been there for generations. So you can be, in a sense, you know, a migrant and be determined as being not of us, not of this place, even if you haven't moved anywhere. So there is this slight kind of stigma attached to the idea. One reason we have this category, as I say, of expats, is that, you know, in that categorization, these Europeans, they were not migrants. They might have moved across the empire to South Africa or to India or to wherever, but they never thought of themselves as migrants, even though they had moved in that way. So there's this disconnect between migrants and expats, and it doesn't always involve movement. The other thing to say is that, of course, if you ask the average sort of British person in the street, the average white British person in the street about kind of immigrants and migrants, they might have all kinds of weird ideas about, you know, who fits under that category. So they might think of most of the population of Leicester, say, as being kind of immigrants, when those people are not. They were kind of born here, they've been brought up here, but they might think of any people who are who who are black or brown as kind of not being authentically English or British in some sense. So you get these kind of folk categorizations of who's an immigrant and who isn't an immigrant that don't really map onto the legal categories at all. And generally, I think in campaigning and in kind of solidarity work and all that kind of thing, it's often best just to focus on kind of people. There are people, they're here, they're in kind of relationships, there are neighbors, there are co-workers, and they are kind of experiencing all kinds of problems in their lives because of kind of paperwork, because of discrimination and so on. And I think it's really important not to use terminology that tends to legitimize that, that tends to undermine their claim to be part of us.
I was going to say, I liked what you said there, Chris, and it kind of made me think, is that why, I guess, if you look at it this way, is that why, I guess, people who are labelled as migrants, it depends, I guess, on their social economic status and their race as well, because the term expat, I'll often find exclusively for white people. And also when I think of expat, I think of a certain enjoyment of privileges to live somewhere else and not be seen as an other because you are, I guess, the main standard. Almost everybody else is the other, considering.
No, I think I agree with you, Kimberly, but I think it's more about showing the status, because very often British people, when they move to another country, they would call themselves expats, and I hear often arguments saying because this is purely by choice, and the migrants from, I don't know, Eastern Europe or other poor countries, they come because they have to. So I think people like to divide this economic migrants who come here to our country to do the jobs we don't like, and there is expats who move to another country to, I don't know, to the coast of Spain to live a more comfortable life that they would do in the UK. So I think I really dislike this terminology at the moment, because it's just dividing people into us and them, the second category and non-second category people. And I think Brexit make the situation even worse, because obviously it will be extremely difficult now to migrate to the UK from, like, the poorer countries, so-called. But obviously those rich expats, they will move freely anyway. And I think it's just showing this divided between poorer and non-poorer people at the moment. But yeah, expat is very focused on, I think, class.
I was also going to say, I think sometimes the hardest thing is if we were to remove all terminology, then what would we replace it with? And I don't think there will ever be a general umbrella term that can cover everybody without groups feeling, I guess, singled out. And I think sometimes it depends on individuals and how they identify, because who are we as individual organisations to say, you're from here, so you can have this status? It's almost as though we'll be trying to counteract the very thing that we're trying to stop, because we will be categorising as well to a certain aspect. So I think it is quite difficult.
I think if we would ever achieve kind of equality and the society when everyone is accepted and equal, we won't need any labels, because everyone will be just a person living in the society. But until we reach the stage, we almost need the labels to protect certain groups, and I think at the moment how the diversity laws are constructed. But unfortunately, migrant is not protective characteristic in our current equality legislation. Is not very clearly defined, so people can be very easily othered without any consequences or without any protection. So as much as I would love not to have a label, but at the situation as it is, I currently advocate for those labels. I would love to have the review of them, but it's the same when we looked into the BAME and BME categories, where for instance, we have to label ourselves like, you know, an other white in the world where you can only exist if you have strong identity. And if you can represent very strong group, and you can then argue, oh, okay, I'm diverse, I'm different, I'm marginalized, I need extra measures to help our group to be included or to combat discrimination. But in a situation when we can just somewhere at the end of the form have to say an other white, we're not going to achieve anything, and we're not going to protect people and have this positive measures and motivations really to include. So as sad as it is, but we need those labels, and we need a little bit more than we have at the moment.
And I think just my input on this is that, like, so you may have that, you may see yourself a certain way, like if maybe even if you were born in the UK, you'd consider yourself as English, as British, but if others don't see you the same way, that a lot of the complication starts on that. And I'm thinking of the example of David Lammy. He had a conversation on the radio last week. He was like, he is English, but he's not, he's not seen as that. And someone here on TikTok said as well that their daughter was born in the UK, but at school she's still called an immigrant because of where her parents are from. So it almost like it doesn't matter how you see yourself, how you label yourself, because how others will see you sometimes has such a stronger significance and influence as well.
Yes,
I agree with that, and I think if you're not a citizen, you'll always be an other. And sometimes as migrants, obviously we've migrated to the UK, so I don't know what term everybody else uses, but I'm going to use migrant on the We Belong perspective. But when we use these terms, I guess it's hard to cover everybody, but I get what Shukri was saying earlier, that people will say, oh, you don't sound like a migrant, or you don't sound like an immigrant, but what's an immigrant supposed to sound like? And it's almost as though there are these unspoken rules to being a migrant, and there's boxes, even there's boxes we can see and also we can't see, and that's also embedded within biases when it comes to employment opportunities or even in the sector in which we operate. And I think a lot of that needs unpicking, but because of the basis of where we come from as a nation, as a country, in the history that Chris was saying, deep rooted in colonization, perhaps maybe the whole system needs dismantling before we can get to a point where everybody's satisfied.
Yeah, so I had a thought when everyone was speaking. I mean, we also have to consider where we actually are. We are in, the UK. I mean, if we, like, for example, if we looked at America, it is the land of immigrants. They kind of have a different thought about citizenship. It's more like if you pay, into taxes, you work, and you get, our citizenship. You're basically American. You're basically like the next, you're like, your white neighbor next door in most areas. There is biases, obviously, but that's their, that's their. I don't want to say nationalism, but that's what they believe in. Immigrants make America, and that isn't like the UK. I mean, the UK is very, I imagine, in comparison, pretty closed off, especially with it being, a big superpower in the 18th and 19th and even early 20th century. I mean, it's just, yeah. I mean, even in the Netherlands, I mean, my parents came to, the Netherlands in the 1990s, and back then, there wasn't many immigrants. The only immigrants were ex-colonies like Suriname and the Caribbean, the Dutch Caribbean, and so they were seen pretty differently because they weren't there for economic reasons, and also they had a completely different, reason of being there. And there was even a point where the Dutch government tried to desegregate immigrant, like refugee or immigrant communities, just to improve integration. But then the whole problem is the Dutch are kind of notorious for being hard to make friends with, and it can't need it from both ways. I mean, I was talking to a Danish man in Denmark a few weeks ago, and he was very, you know, he saw the difference between a refugee and an immigrant and an expat, and I was a bit confused as to why, because, you know, the whole point is all of those categories come into a country at some point, no matter what the region is. And he was very much like, refugees get, you know, they can, you know, because they didn't have the choice of coming, they can, you know, they can take their time into integration. But a migrant or an immigrant who had the choice has to integrate, and they have to show that they are, you know, they want the country, and, you know, because they chose to come here. You know, we didn't invite them to come here. And I think, you know, with that growing nationalism we have in Europe, I think it's very important to note, because, you know, the identity or even the terminology is changing, and immigrants is, it shouldn't be, but it is a sort of negative word, and that's why people cling on to expat. Because, I mean, in theory, I am a Western European. If I was white, I would call myself an expat, but then the problem is I'm not. So even though I could technically, it'd be weird for me to say that I'm an expat, even from my own, you know, from my mouth. It's just very strange. So I think we also have to consider what the UK was before with colonialism, and also, you know, how it was a superpower even in you know, the 50s and 60s, and how, you know, for example, Poland was, you know, a communist country on the, you know, Iron Curtain, I think it's called. So I think you have to consider that, and I think all of that comes into play when you talk about identity, stuff like that.
I just wanted to comment on something you said earlier, Shukri, when you said the person that was asking, was explaining the differences between migrant, refugee, and sorry, I forgot what the third term.
Immigrant. Yeah.
Immigrant. And they were saying, obviously, the immigrants have a choice, but what about children? You know, I came to the UK when I was 9 years old. I didn't have a choice to get on a plane and come. So what box would I fit in? You know?
I mean, that's why I said to him as well. I mean, I think for them, you'd be closer to the citizen of that country, but you'd be treated in this. I don't know. It was just, we didn't really end much, but yeah, that's why.
We have a question from the audience, so I just want to make sure that we can bring her in. So Marcella, you are now you're allowed to talk now. We've unmuted you, so feel free to unmute and to ask your question or bring in your comment.
Thank you. Yes, I just want to make a comment about what Shukri was saying, really, because I think legislation has a lot to do with this. I'm coming from South America. I am the grandchild of immigrants. I am the daughter of immigrants, but I was always treated as an Argentine because I was born in Argentina, and it didn't matter where my parents or my grandparents were born, because that concept of where you are born, you belong. Whereas my son came here at 5 years old, and I will argue he went to the same school, playing the same football teams. He did exactly what all the other boys did. But last year, when he became 18, he was not allowed to vote because he wasn't British. So, and I was, you know, that brings us that sort of discussion, I think, on how the legislation had a lot to do with this. Because if in the UK we allow children to be British because they're born in the UK, only because they were born in the UK, we will have a different conversation as well, I think.
I think there is no simple answer to this, because I know that sometimes people think once our children will be born in this country, if they white, if they speak English, if they can behave like English, they will be accepted. But we can see now from at least I know quite well the Eastern European perspective that is not the case. We have at the moment children who are born in these countries. In this country, they speak perfect English. They they behave. They were born here. The British citizens from the start, and children in school would still find out, even if children, we coming across the cases when even Eastern European children, when they would have even only one parent Eastern European and the other would be British, English, white, middle class, whatever, fitting into this perfect world, their children are still being bullied because it's always, because we need to look into othering and marginalizing others, and how this perception is, because it's not on the surface, it might be about citizenship or whiteness or Westerness or something like this. But in reality, if the society have a strong belief that someone coming from Eastern Europe is not equal to us, is the worst kind of person, is really, this is what bullies even in primary school will pick on. And we really need to focus on accepting any form of otherness and stop. I think we need to really deeply decolonize the world, because first of all, we have people are being very different if they come from post-colonial country, and there is very difference if they come from outside of the colonies. There is very, and people. People build those stereotypes, people build those concept of others and someone who is a threat, someone who is a different, or someone who is simply we can place below us, or say it's worse than us. There are some research done in some part of the Britain when saying that even up to 75% of Eastern European young people in primary and secondary school are being bullied because of who they are. And really, if we want to achieve a change for the society, we need to look a little bit deeper, and we need to completely decolonize and deconstruct the system as it is. And using this, I think, from political point of view, dividing people into like refugees, migrants, immigrants, and this is we are fall into very different categories with very different entitlements, rights, and the position with the society. But I think it's one of divide and conquer role, because the more we are divided as a migrants, as the other, the more isolated we will be. Because I find it even among organizations supporting migrants and refugees, there is this division. Someone think maybe refugees are more important, or someone will think this migrants are more important. It's like, it's those categories often don't help us to build solidarity and maybe to build a kind of really global movement aiming to deconstruct the otherness.
Yeah, I was going to say, Alicia, just to add to that, I think it brings us to what Chris was saying, that's important to look at people with a sense of humanity, and not to look at people based on these labels, because then with those labels, you almost remove yourself from the individual, and you almost place them in a box, in a category with already placed assumptions. And I think we then initialize our own prejudices within those, and whatever you hear from the media or whatever is fueled by the policies and the government about who's entitled to X, Y, Z, almost then automatically puts that hierarchy even amongst our own communities as people who aren't British. So I think first and foremost that humanity needs to come back and looking at people as people. But I don't know how that can be done on a policy perspective, because I do feel like it is necessary to have those different categories if they're looking at different entitlements. But then you then risk that issue of which group is more entitled than the other, because currently at the moment people who are on limited leave to remain, so for the young people that We Belong supports, they're on the 10-year route to settlement. And this is the only group amongst all the groups that we have in migration who have to wait 10 years, and the fees continually increase. And yet we've seen, I guess, I don't want to say the success of the EU settlement scheme, because by far, it has been something, but I wouldn't say overall successful, because some people are still being missed under the net. But how is it that, you know, that can be put into provisions and groups can be provided 5-year routes to settlement, and there's still another group that's waiting 10 years? It then makes people who are non-European or non-British to feel as though there is a hierarchy. Is it depending on race? Could it be possibly that? Because I have friends who are from America or Canada, and they came after me and they've got citizenship, and I'm not going to be a citizen until I'm 30. So it brings those questions within yourself. Sorry, I'll finish there.
So I think
Oh, come on in.
yeah, I think on that, the whole way the Windrush scandal went is very instructive, because when Theresa May introduced the hostile environment provisions, I don't think she really understood that all these people who didn't have adequate documentation would be caught up in it. So to that extent, I don't think that victimization was deliberate. But when it happened, when it came to light, it took a long time to persuade the Home Office that there really was a problem and to get some kind of action on it. And then, although there's a kind of public recognition in the media by politicians that a really terrible injustice was done to a group of people, actually, you know, if you imagine that a group of white people had suffered that kind of injustice, that kind of indignity, deportations, deprivation of important medical treatment and so on, there'll be far more kind of public outrage about that than there was in the case of the Windrush victims. And I think that speaks to a sense that, you know, in the eyes of many in the British public and the British media, that that some people are kind of properly, authentically British and they really count, and there are other people who count less, and it really doesn't matter so much if terrible things happen to them. And I think that, you know, that was also kind of behind the David Lammy interview that Lara was referencing. You know, the absolute refusal of the woman on the call to acknowledge that David Lammy could be English.
Definitely. And that brings into our last question, because I am very cognizant of time. We have about 7 minutes left. This has been such an interesting discussion. My goodness, it just flies by. But I want to hear from everybody. That's why I want to make sure that everyone can chime in on this last question. So try to keep your responses short. It's 3 questions in one, so I would love to hear. They're all very, very related. So the first one is, how does the term migrant, like how does using that term affect our public messaging? Do politicians pay more attention if we use migrant versus, you know, another term? And then lastly, just to wrap it all up, should we use this term? Should we use the term migrant? Should we reclaim it? Should we avoid it? What is everyone's opinion on that? So I'll start with Chris, because I haven't heard much from you in the session, and then we'll go around from everybody. But again, try and keep your responses short, because we don't have a lot of time left.
Okay, so in terms of kind of practical utility, dealing with politicians and so on, and also campaigning with the general public, I think that it's really important to kind of bring out the particular kind of human problems that face individuals. And they can be of all kinds. They can be to do with kind of spousal migration and whether your kind of marriage is accepted. They can be to do with kind of destitution, access to public funds, rights to work. And I think it's really important to bring home those particular consequences for people, rather than you know, talking about kind of migrants' rights in the abstract. I mean, it's okay to use the word kind of migrant, migration, immigrant, and so on, but I think what is important is to kind of get through that kind of that kind of skin of indifference that that kind of protects politicians and journalists and so on from taking some of these concerns seriously. And the other thing I just wanted to get in sort of quickly is that one of the kind of big differences between people who have British nationality and people who don't have British nationality is liability to deportation. And there's this big kind of folk devil figure in public political discourse at the moment, the foreign criminal. And I think it's really important to push back against that, because many of these people who are so-called, foreign criminals, they may have grown up in this country, they've lived in this country for kind of years, for decades sometimes. That's where all their connections are. They may have never visited a place, they may not speak a language, and yet here we are putting them on deportation flights to countries where they really have no family, they have no connections, they have no prospect of making a life. And the absence of British nationality in their case makes them extraordinarily vulnerable. And I think we need to try and get through to politicians that that's a really, it's a really dangerous game to play, this discourse of the foreign criminal. We need to think about the human situation of many of those people.
I agree. I guess I could just chime in on that. I completely agree with you, Chris, because I think it then reinforces the idea of, I guess, migrant being associated with criminality. And you often find, I guess, in the past where you've had those go home vans or increasingly negative press about migrants or stories where somebody's done something. I think that makes migrants more almost really wary, distrusting as well, to the point where if we bring it to our current time at the moment with COVID, we had migrants who were afraid to seek support and go to the hospitals or go to the doctors because of their immigration status and because of the negative labels placed on those terminologies. So although I support the use of the term migrant, I think it's important to still use the identifiers so that you then don't miss out or invisibilize a group. So whether it's undocumented migrant or migrants with limited leave or migrants, I don't know, I think the term still should be used, however, in a positive way. And I think politicians do pay more attention if you are specific, because I think, again, what we're seeing at the moment with policies, the unintended consequences, where there's been a one size fits all, almost hostile environment across the board, and it makes it really, really difficult. And I think if we disbanded all the titles in terms of migrant or our key identifiers, then we also then lose our identity. So I think it's important to still keep those words. Politicians, they do listen, and even when if they're still insistent on keeping migrants in those brackets, then it's our role as activists, as civil society, to keep applying that pressure and actually encouraging a conversation, because sometimes people don't know the differences between a refugee or an asylum seeker, or like Alicia was saying, coming from a non-European migrant perspective, I didn't understand your experience until you shared your story and we had that conversation. So I think an encouragement of further conversations, even difficult conversations, particularly at this time, will be really important.
Definitely. We'd love to hear from Alicia and Shukri as well.
Yes, I can support Chris and Kimberly. I completely agree. And I think as much as we would love to have, maybe not to have labels on a very personal level, and when we interact with other people and we want to feel all equal, in terms of the political and public debate, we still need them, because otherwise we cannot bring up the issues and politicians respond maybe a little bit better. I'm not entirely sure whether the term migrant is really motivating politicians to do something about this, because it's sometimes I feel they don't maybe show that much interest, because migrant migration is something you choose to do, and it's almost like it's you came here, it's your problem, solve your life kind of thing. But sometimes when we speak to the politicians as an organization, often have to bring how much it costs you if migrants will not integrate, so we're saying, it's almost, if migrants don't integrate, it's likely become, homeless, or they become exploited, and, the cost on they don't use the public services, but then burden if issues are not solved quickly is much higher, especially on NHS. So it's all of those kind of arguments. So it's almost like bringing the what actually means to be a migrant, because it's more integration is a problem. Being a migrant is not a problem. It's like being, marginalization is a problem, or marginalization of migrants is a problem. So so those arguments, but in a kind of more global perspective, and how we want to use or not use the term migrant, I'm at the moment pro using migrant, but let's embrace it, let's reclaim it, let's make it positive, let's be proud of it. And we cannot escape it. This is who, this is the identity of someone who's newcomer, or it's even if it's a second generation, we should be proud of it.
And Shukri, I'd love to hear your voice on this as well.
Yes, so I was going to say that migrant is the best word that we can use. I mean, it's for all the reasons that we stated earlier, it's the best that we can use, and indeed that politicians don't really themselves know the difference, or if we're looking at a more cynical view, that they don't care for the reason. I mean, we saw probably earlier in the COVID period when Boris Johnson was asked about, migrants with the non-recourse to public funds. What would they've just been out of work, furloughed or whatever, and they need some kind of help. But they are again, but then the problem is that they can't get public funds. So where do we go from here? And you could see in his confusion. I don't know if it was confusion or just him not really caring for the difference. But he didn't seem like he knew that there would be people with limited leave to remain who have no recourse to public funds, and you can even see that with EU citizens with pre-settled status, while they may have some recourse to public funds, it is complex, and it's complex, and yeah, so politicians, I feel like they see they see anyone who isn't British in the sense of with birth, or with a birth nationality, they see them as one, except some expats who plan to go back to their country later on. Some do, some don't. That's why we have such a multicultural Britain, because not everyone goes back to where they were born, or where they where their heritage comes from, because Britain is a great place to be above else. So yeah, I just think migrant, we should probably change the way that migrant is seen. It is still very it's kind of like a taboo thing, I find, because I know that I have British family members. They don't like to count themselves as British, even though they've been here for like 20 plus years. And you can be a migrant and British. I think that's what you need to portray, because one doesn't cancel out the other. And I've been here for nearly 15 years. I would nearly call myself a British. That most of that problem is within me, my identity, and my my the Brexit. But I would, if Brexit didn't happen, I would call myself British, actually. So yeah, I think you can be both British and a migrant, just like you can be American and you can be a migrant. You can be Dutch and a migrant. You can have multiple labels applied to you. It doesn't have to just be one.
That's such a great way to wrap up a little bit. Now, we are going to stay over a little bit because we have one more question, but I do want to be really respectful that we did say we would end at 7. So if any of our speakers need to leave, that's completely okay. And thank you so much for coming. This has been such an interesting panel. So I just want to say thank you so much. We will be staying on for about 10 more minutes, but if you have to leave, that's completely fine. So I do want to be very respectful of everybody's time. So I want to say thank you so much for coming because this has been such an interesting and engaging overall discussion, definitely. So I'm going to pass it to Laura to ask that last question, but feel free to go if you need to. And thank you again for coming.
Yeah, the question is that I have to ask is the ethnic minorities question. And that's just because in every BAME election, I know that term is just complicated in itself. But some people tell me oh, why did you not vote in that BAME election? And I'm like, I don't know, I don't know what to do. So is there a straightforward answer to that question, or is it another debate in itself we're having right now? And maybe this is a question that Chris knows the answer to, otherwise others are free to comment as well, but that's just a question that I've always been very curious about, and I haven't found a straightforward answer to.
Okay, so I'm not quite sure exactly what the question is, though, Lara. Can you just?
Are EU citizens who are white ethnic minorities?
Right. Okay. So so I don't think, and since I don't think there's any kind of straightforward answer to that question. So this whole issue of kind of minorities within a country, ethnic minorities and so on, it really kind of first comes up historically when we can start to organize the world into nation states, and then there are people within the borders of states who say speak different languages or who have different ethnicities, and then there's a question about whether people belong to groups that are sufficiently large within the society, sufficiently kind of coordinated within society to really sort of count as a collective thing, as opposed to the just being kind of individuals who happen to share a nationality or share a language. So I would say that there's no kind of simple yes/no answer to that question. So some groups constitute kind of minorities in the sense that they have a degree of kind of organization and collective consciousness, and perhaps some are in the process of becoming ethnic minorities in that sense, because it's partly a question of numbers, partly a question of coordination, I think.
If maybe I can jump next. My straight answer is no. I cannot. I can see, Chris, your point. Ethnic minorities as a minority group, I would imagine someone who would share the characteristic, don't kind of belong to the, I don't know, main society, main group, and remain on the margins. But I cannot see how EU citizens would become a group. Why not European citizens? As I cannot see how someone who would be from Germany would be ethnic minority, but from Norway not. So I don't. If we would ever even consider Europeans being a minority, I wouldn't divide it into the EU and non-EU, and especially that I can see more need for maybe Eastern Europeans to become minority. Someone who come, I don't know, maybe from Belarus, or someone who come from Albania and have almost no rights and is very openly discriminated and excluded from the society. Maybe there we could consider labeling people as an ethnic minority for this reason. Sometimes we could see maybe even Central and Eastern European as a group which is very different from Western Europe, but the EU is not. EU here doesn't define if people are marginalized or not, because you can be from EU country, but and be marginalized, or you can be from outside like Norway and be perfectly fine. So I don't think the EU border would be, you know, the defining identity.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, we don't need to start another conversation on that. I just wondered if there was a simple answer, but clearly nothing has a simple answer.
I think we will wrap it up there then, because this has been such an interesting debate, and I do want to be really respectful of everyone's time. I feel like this is a kind of conversation we could go on for 4 hours, for 4 days. You know, this is such, there's so many complexities to this, and we've just, you know, touched the surface level of all of them. So I want to say thank you so much to everyone for coming, again, both those who are watching and our fantastic panelists. I encourage you to keep having these conversations, you know, have these conversations with your friends, with your families, with academics, with campaigners and NGOs, because as we've been talking about, it's so important just to have these conversations, to raise awareness and to develop understanding, to make sure that we are inclusive as possible, and to try and have policy that reflects that as well. It's not just about the term, again, it's what that term means in practical reality. So thank you everyone so much again for coming. I encourage everyone to follow up with our panelists. All the links are in the chats. And thank you again for everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Mm.